The darkness in this apartment doesn't feel like night. It feels like an ending. I sat at the small, scarred kitchen table in the shadows, my fingers tracing the cold glass of my insulin vial. The refrigerator had stopped humming 20 minutes ago. I could still hear the heavy boots of the utility worker walking down the gravel path outside. I had begged him, just for one more day, explaining that the medicine needed to stay cold, but he wouldn't look at me. "I don't make the rules, Mr. Carter," he'd mumbled, staring at his clipboard. "The bill is 3 months past due. Talk to your son." I wanted to tell him that my son, Mark, was the one who took my checkbook. I wanted to tell him I was a United States Marine who survived the jungles of Vietnam and 40 years in the Youngstown steel mills, but the words died in my throat. Old men like me are supposed to be invisible. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around my chest, feeling the sharp chill of the Ohio winter creeping through the floorboards. Buster, my old golden retriever, rested his chin on my knee. He whimpered, his stomach growling in the silence. I hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, so he could have the last of the kibble, but even that was gone now. I stood up, my knees popping like dry twigs, and walked to the window. Across the street, the lights of my old home, the house I'd lived in for 50 years, flickered on. It was a beautiful, warm glow. I watched a young man I didn't know carry a box of groceries through the front door I'd painted forest green every 5 years. I saw a woman through the window, laughing as she set a table I had built from reclaimed oak. They looked so happy in the house that was supposed to be my legacy. My heart felt like a piece of wet charcoal, heavy and cold. My son had told me the house needed upgrades and that I'd be safer in a senior living community while he handled the paperwork. Instead, he tucked me into this rat-trap apartment and stopped answering his phone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my last 42 cents, the copper and silver mocking me. I looked back at the warm house across the street, the house where Martha's ghost still lived in the corners of the rooms. Just as I turned to find a candle, I saw my son's car pull into my old driveway, and he wasn't alone. Mark stepped out of his sleek black SUV, the kind of car that cost more than I made in 3 years at the mill. He was wearing a tailored wool coat, looking every bit the successful real estate developer I'd helped him become. He didn't look across the street at the crumbling apartment building where his father sat in the dark. He didn't look at the window where I stood, hidden by the shadows. He walked straight to the young couple on the porch and shook the man's hand, laughing. He handed them a bottle of expensive wine, a celebration of a sale I never authorized. My hands began to shake, not from the cold, but from a sudden, sharp realization. He hadn't just moved me for my safety, he had liquidated my life while I was recovering from that small stroke in the VA hospital. I remembered the way he'd brought those papers to my bedside, telling me they were just medical releases so he could talk to the doctors. I had trusted him because he was my blood, the boy I'd taught to fish in the Cuyahoga River. I sank into my recliner, the springs groaning under my weight. Buster licked my hand, his tongue sandpaper dry. "I'm sorry, boy. I'm so sorry." I thought back to the factory, the heat of the furnace, the way the soot stayed under my fingernails no matter how hard I scrubbed. I'd done it all for him. I skipped vacations and wore the same pair of boots for a decade so he could go to that fancy college in Columbus. Now I was 79 years old, and the only thing I owned was a box of old photos and a medal for valor that didn't buy groceries. I reached for the phone, my breath hitching as I dialed his number for the 20th time today. It went straight to voicemail. "Mark, it's Dad," I said, my voice cracking. "The power is out. I need my medicine kept cold, son. Please. I saw you across the street. Just come over for 5 minutes." I hung up, knowing the call was a scream into a vacuum. I looked at the photo of Martha on the side table, her smile frozen in 1974. She would have been so ashamed of him. She always said Mark had a restless heart, but I never thought it was a heart of stone. As the room grew colder, I realized I couldn't stay here and wait to disappear. I stood up, grabbed my cane, and decided to walk across that street to claim what was mine, even if it cost me the last of my dignity. The walk across the street felt like crossing a minefield in the dark. Every step sent a jolt of pain through my hips, and the freezing Ohio wind cut through my thin jacket like a razor. Buster stayed close to my side, his tail tucked between his legs. When I reached the edge of my old lawn, the lawn I'd mowed every Saturday for half a century, I stopped. The grass was trimmed perfectly, but the flower beds where Martha grew her prize-winning peonies were gone, replaced by gray river rock. It looked modern. It looked heartless. I climbed the steps to the porch, my chest heaving. I could hear music playing inside, something upbeat and expensive sounding. I raised my hand and knocked on the door. It was the young man who answered. He looked startled to see an old man in a threadbare coat shivering on his mat. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice polite but guarded. "I'm Raymond Carter," I said, trying to stand as tall as my spine would allow. I used to live here. My son, Mark. I think there's been a mistake." Before the young man could respond, Mark stepped into the foyer behind him. His face went pale, then instantly turned into a mask of cold fury. He stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him, cutting off the warmth and the music. "What are you doing here, Dad?" he hissed, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "You're embarrassing yourself. Go back to the apartment." I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw a stranger. "The power is off, Mark. My insulin is getting warm, and I want to know why these people are in my house." Mark grabbed my arm, his grip too tight, and began to lead me down the steps. "It's not your house anymore. You signed the deed over months ago. You couldn't handle the taxes or the upkeep. I did you a favor, Dad. I put the money into an account for your care." I stopped walking and yanked my arm away. "What money? I have 42 cents. I'm starving, and my dog hasn't eaten in 2 days. Mark rolled his eyes and reached for his wallet, pulling out a $50 bill and shoving it into my pocket. "Go buy a burger and some batteries. I'll call the electric company tomorrow. Now go home before I have to call the police to trespass you." He turned and walked back inside, locking the door with a click that sounded like a gunshot. I stood on the sidewalk, the $50 bill feeling like a brand on my thigh, realizing my son had just traded his father's soul for a commission. I didn't go to the store. I walked back to that dark apartment, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The $50 bill sat on the table next to my dead phone. It felt dirty. I looked at Buster, who was sniffing the floor for crumbs. I felt a wave of nausea. I had spent my whole life being a provider, a protector, and now I was a nuisance to be paid off and hidden away. I sat down and opened my old footlocker, the one I'd kept since the Corps. Inside were my discharge papers, my marriage license, and the one thing I had kept secret even from Mark, my wife's engagement ring. It was a modest diamond, but it represented 3 years of overtime at the mill. I had planned to give it to Mark's daughter when she turned 18, but Mark had cut off my contact with my granddaughter months ago, claiming I was confused and upsetting to the children. I tucked the ring into my pocket. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I walked 2 miles to the local Social Security Administration office. My legs were screaming, and my vision blurred at the edges, but I kept going. I sat in the plastic chair for 4 hours, clutching my number, until a woman with tired eyes called me to the window. "How could I help you, Mr. Carter?" she asked. "I need to see where my checks are going," I said. "They haven't hit my account in 3 months." She typed into her computer, her brow furrowing. "It looks here like you signed a power of attorney over to a Mark Carter. The deposits are being routed to a business account, Carter Development Group." My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. It wasn't just the house. He was harvesting my pension and my Social Security, leaving me just enough to stay alive in a dark room. "Is there a problem?" she asked, noticing how gray I'd turned. "Yes," I whispered. "There's a very big problem." I left the office and headed toward the VA clinic. I needed my medicine, but more than that, I needed someone to believe me. As I walked, I passed a Walmart and used $5 of Mark's hush money to buy a bag of dog food. I carried it the rest of the way, the heavy bag feeling like a cross. When I finally reached the clinic, the nurse took one look at me and called for a wheelchair. "Mr. Carter, your blood pressure is through the roof," she said, her voice full of concern. I gripped her hand, my eyes finally filling with the tears I'd been holding back for weeks. "Please," I choked out. "My son, he's erased me." The VA social worker, a woman named Sarah with a sharp mind and a soft voice, sat across from me in the small exam room. She listened as I told her everything: the medical releases at the hospital, the locked door of my own home, the diverted pension, and the cold darkness of the apartment. She didn't look at me like I was a confused old man. She looked at me like I was a soldier who had been betrayed by his own unit. "Raymond," she said softly, "what your son did is called elder financial abuse. It's a crime." I shook my head, my pride still fighting a losing battle. "He's my boy, Sarah. I just wanted him to be successful. I didn't think he'd leave me with nothing." She leaned forward, her expression fierce. "He didn't just leave you with nothing. He took your dignity. He took your wife's legacy. We're going to get it back." She helped me fill out forms I didn't fully understand, contacting the bank and the SSA to freeze the accounts. But as she worked, a thought struck me like a physical blow. Martha's ring. I reached into my pocket to feel the small velvet pouch I'd put it in, but my hand met only empty fabric. I stood up, frantic, patting my jacket, my trousers. It was gone. I must have dropped it during the long walk or when I collapsed into the wheelchair. That ring was the only piece of Martha I had left. It was the only thing Mark hadn't been able to touch, and now I'd lost it because I was too weak to even walk to the clinic. I felt the room spinning. "Raymond, sit down!" Sarah yelled, catching me as I slumped. I didn't care about the blood pressure anymore. I didn't care about the house. "I lost her," I sobbed, the sound raw and ugly. "I lost the only thing that mattered." They kept me in the infirmary overnight for observation. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the beep of the monitors, feeling like a ghost that had finally stopped haunting the world. Around midnight, the door opened quietly. It wasn't a nurse. It was Mark. He was wearing his expensive coat, but he looked disheveled, his eyes red. He didn't come to apologize. He leaned over my bed, his voice a terrifying whisper. "The bank called me, Dad. You froze the accounts. Do you have any idea what you've done? I have a bridge loan closing tomorrow. If that money isn't there, I lose everything." I looked at my son and realized he wasn't seeing a father. He was seeing a line item on a balance sheet. "You sold my home, Mark," I said, my voice surprisingly steady for a man whose world was in ashes. "You left me in the dark without my medicine. You let Buster go hungry." Mark let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "That house was a money pit, Dad. I sold it for 3 times what you paid for it. I was going to move you into a real facility once the development deal went through. He just had to wait." He paced the small room, his shadows dancing on the wall like a monster. "Undo the freeze, Dad. Call the bank. Tell them it was a mistake. If you don't, I won't be able to pay the rent on that apartment. You'll be on the street. Is that what you want? To be a homeless vet?" I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel sadness. I felt the old steel of the mill in my spine. I remembered why I'd earned those medals in the jungle. It wasn't for the glory. It was for the person standing next to you. And Mark wasn't standing next to me. He was standing over me. "Get out," I said. He stepped closer, his face inches from mine. "Dad, don't be stupid. You have nothing without me." I pointed to the door with a shaking finger. "I said, get out. You're not my son. My son died a long time ago." He stared at me for a long beat, his jaw clenching, before he turned and slammed the door so hard the glass rattled. I lay there in the silence, my heart thumping a steady, rhythmic beat. I wasn't going back to that apartment. I wasn't going to be his victim anymore. An hour later, a nurse came in. She held a small, dirty velvet pouch in her hand. "One of the orderlies found this in the parking lot," she said with a smile. "Is it yours?" I took the pouch, my fingers trembling as I opened it. Martha's ring caught the fluorescent light, sparkling like a tiny, defiant star. I pressed it to my lips and wept silently. I still had her, and I still had my name. The next morning, Sarah, the social worker, returned. She had a look of grim determination on her face. "Raymond, we did some digging into the sale of your house. There's something you need to see. The young couple you saw? They aren't homeowners, they're actors. Mark didn't sell the house to them. He sold it to a shell company he owns. He was using your house as collateral for a massive high-interest loan for a shopping mall project that's currently failing. The betrayal had a new, sharper edge. He hadn't just sold my home. He was using it as a gambling chip." The gravity of the situation settled over me like a shroud. Mark hadn't just been greedy. He had been desperate. He was drowning, and he decided to use his own father as a life raft, pushing my head underwater so he could stay afloat. Sarah explained that because the sale was to a shell company he controlled, and because I could prove I was under medical distress when the papers were signed, we had a chance to void the whole thing. "But it's going to be a fight, Raymond," she warned. "He'll fight dirty." I looked at Martha's ring. "I've been in dirtier places than a courtroom, Sarah." Over the next week, the VA helped me move into a temporary veterans housing unit. It was small, but it was warm, and the lights stayed on. They let me bring Buster, who finally started to put some weight back on his bones. Every day I went to the legal clinic. We gathered every scrap of paper, my mill pension statements, my medical records from the day of the stroke, the utility shut-off notices. We even found the original deed from 1965, which had a specific clause Martha and I had added, a life estate, that gave me the right to live there until the day I died. Mark had conveniently lost that page when he filed the new paperwork. One afternoon, while I was sitting in the VA park, a car pulled up. It wasn't Mark's SUV, it was a beat-up sedan. A woman got out, Sarah, Mark's ex-wife. She was holding the hand of my granddaughter, Lily. My heart nearly stopped. "Grandpa!" Lily cried, breaking away and running to me. I caught her, the smell of her shampoo like strawberries filling my senses. I hadn't seen her in 6 months. "Mark told us you were in a specialized hospital and couldn't have visitors," Sarah said, her eyes glistening with anger. "He told me you'd lost your mind, Raymond, but then I saw the legal notice from the VA about the house. I knew he was lying." She sat next to me on the bench. "He's lost everything, Raymond. The mall project went bust, the bank is foreclosing on his own house, he's been using your money to pay off his private lenders. He's scared." I stroked Lily's hair, feeling a cold clarity. My son was a predator, but he was also a coward. He'd stolen from a man who would have given him everything if he'd only asked. "He's coming for you, Raymond," Sarah whispered. "He knows the hearing is Friday. He's going to try to make you drop the charges." I looked at her, then at the little girl who carried my wife's eyes. "Let him come," I said. The confrontation happened 2 days before the hearing. I was walking Buster near the housing unit when Mark's SUV screeched to a halt beside us. He jumped out, and he looked terrible. His expensive coat was stained, and his eyes were sunken and wild. He didn't look like a developer anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. "Dad, listen to me," he gasped, grabbing my shoulders. "You have to stop this. If the judge voids that sale, the lenders will come after me for fraud. I'll go to prison, Dad. Do you want that? Do you want your only son in a cell?" I looked at his hands on my coat, the hands I'd taught to hold a baseball bat, the hands I'd held when he was a toddler with a fever. "You put me in the dark, Mark," I said quietly. "You took my medicine. You let my dog starve. You lied to your wife and your daughter. You told them I was crazy." Mark shook me, his voice rising to a shriek. "I was trying to build something for the family, for Lily. It was just a temporary loan. I was going to pay it all back." "With what? You don't have a soul left to trade." He let go of me, his face twisting into something ugly. "You're an old man, Raymond. You're going to die in a few years anyway. Why do you need that house? Why do you need that money? It's mine. It's my inheritance." The words hit me like a physical blow. To him, I was already dead. I was just a ghost sitting on his pile of gold. I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. The fear was gone, the grief was still there, but it was tempered by a hard, sharp edge of justice. "The hearing is Friday, Mark. I suggest you get a good lawyer. You're going to need one." He lunged at me, his hand raised as if to strike, but Buster let out a low, thunderous growl that stopped him cold. Mark looked at the dog, then at me, and saw something he didn't expect. A Marine. I didn't flinch, I didn't move. He realized then that he couldn't bully me anymore. He backed away, tripping over his own feet. "You're killing me!" he screamed as he got back into his car. "You're killing your own son!" I watched him drive away, the smell of burnt rubber hanging in the air. I realized then that the strangers in my house weren't the young couple. The real stranger was the man I'd raised. I walked back to my room, took out Martha's ring, and put it on my pinky finger. It was time to go home. The courtroom was quiet, smelling of old paper and floor wax. I sat at the petitioner's table, my back straight, wearing the only suit I owned, the one I'd worn to Martha's funeral. Sarah, the social worker, sat next to me, along with a pro bono attorney from the VA. Across the aisle, Mark sat alone. He didn't have his fancy lawyers anymore. They'd walked away when the money dried up. He looked small. The judge, a woman with gray hair and eyes that had seen everything, reviewed the documents in silence for a long time. She looked at the utility shutoff notices. She looked at the forged signature on the medical release. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice echoing in the chamber, "the evidence of elder financial exploitation here is overwhelming. Not only was the life estate clause in your original deed ignored, but the transfer of title was executed while you were hospitalized and under the influence of heavy medication. This court finds the sale of the property to Carter Development Group to be null and void." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders so suddenly I almost felt lightheaded. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, the diverted pension funds and Social Security payments constitute a criminal matter. I am referring this case to the district attorney for the prosecution of elder abuse and grand larceny. Mark let out a choked sound, his head dropping into his hands. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt a profound, aching sadness for the boy he used to be. As we stood to leave, Mark looked up at me. His face was wet with tears. "Dad, please," he whispered, "don't let them take me. I'm your son." I stopped and looked at him. I thought about the cold nights in the dark. I thought about the look on the utility worker's face. I thought about the strangers laughing in my kitchen while I skipped meals for my dog. "You're my son," I said, my voice steady. "And as your father, I have to teach you the one lesson I clearly failed to give you. There are consequences for breaking a man's heart." I walked out of that courtroom and didn't look back. Sarah was waiting for me in the hallway. "The keys are being returned today, Raymond. The actors are gone. The house is yours again." I nodded, but I knew the house wasn't the same. The memories had been tarnished. But as I walked toward the exit, I saw someone else waiting for me. It was Sarah, Mark's ex-wife, and Lily. Coming back to the house was strange. The modern furniture was gone, leaving only the staging pieces that the bank had seized. The walls were a different color, and the smell of Martha's lemon wax was replaced by something clinical and cold. But as I walked through the front door, the late afternoon sun hit the banister, and for a moment I could see the ghost of my life. I sat on the bottom step and whistled. Buster ran through the rooms, his tail thumping against the walls, finally home. I wasn't alone for long. Sarah and Lily moved in 2 days later. Sarah had lost her home to Mark's bad investments too, and I wasn't about to let my granddaughter grow up in a shelter while I had 5 empty bedrooms. We spent the weekend repainting the kitchen, that forest green I loved. We tore up the gray river rocks and found the dirt where the peonies were waiting to sleep for the winter. Mark was indicted 3 weeks later. He's facing 5 years. People ask me if I'm going to testify against him. I tell them I don't have to. The paper trail speaks for itself. He calls me from the county jail, begging for bail money I don't have, money he spent on his own vanity. I don't hang up, but I don't promise him anything. I tell him I love him, and then I tell him to pray for forgiveness, because the law is much less merciful than a father. Tonight, the house is full of noise. Lily is doing her homework at the oak table. Sarah is cooking a pot of stew, and the smell of onions and beef fills the air. The lights are on, bright and steady. I sat in my old recliner, the one Sarah tracked down from the thrift store where Mark had dumped it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small velvet pouch. I didn't need to hide it anymore. I handed it to Lily. This was your grandmother's. Keep it safe. It's a reminder that no matter how dark it gets, the light always finds a way back if you're proud enough to wait for it. She hugged me, her small arms around my neck, and for the first time in a year, the cold in my bones finally vanished. I am Raymond Carter. I am 79 years old. I am a Marine, a mill worker, and a grandfather. And I am finally, truly, home.